Today, we are taking you to Victorian London, where we will talk about the shames hidden beneath velvet cushions and the pains growing in the shadow of golden chandeliers. This is a story that history books pass over in silence, but that the streets scream. Because tonight, we will walk together through those dim corridors where poverty, morality, and the female body collided. If you're lying under your blanket now, if you're ready to close your eyes, we will bring you whispers from that era, adorned with morality but actually woven with shame. Being a brothel worker in the Victorian era was not just a job. It was the story of survival, exclusion, and being ignored. Being a woman was already hard, but for these women, time flowed even more heavily. As always, we asked you this. Could you share in the comments where you're joining this journey from? Perhaps from a quiet town, or maybe from a bustling city. But rest assured, this story will tell us all something about both history and our humanity. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Because history is not just the history of kings, wars, and palaces, but also the history of dim streets, invisible lives, and those who lived and passed away quietly. If you're ready, let's begin. When we think of the Victorian era, the first things that come to mind are magnificent mansions, lavish balls, elegant hats, and carriages roaming the avenues. Yet, behind this glittering surface, on the other side of the street, were the stories of thousands of people struggling to breathe. From the outside, London seemed like the capital of prosperity and refinement, but from the inside, it was the heart of a system on the verge of decay. Although everything seemed in its place, the greatest contradiction of this era was this: the more ornate it was, the more filled with pain it was. 19th century London was growing with the engine power of the Industrial Revolution. But this growth only brought luxury to a select minority, while pushing the vast majority of the population into the deepest pits of misery. There were lives spent in back alleys, under factory chimneys, in damp basements. Women, children, the elderly, they all either worked 16 hours a day to survive or tried to live by other means that society overlooked. It was during this period that one of the realities clashing most harshly with the moralistic face of the Victorian era was the lives of women working in brothels. These women, disappearing into the shadows under the street lamps, were the silent witnesses of the era's greatest economic and social collapse. While society accused them of immorality, the system had pushed them into this life. There was no alternative. No education. No support. Everything was covered up like a shame that shouldn't be seen. In areas like Whitechapel in East London, there was a brothel, hidden or open, on almost every street. Most of the women, at a young age, sometimes as children, were forced to choose this life to provide for their families or to fend for themselves. But this wasn't a choice. In reality, it was a necessity. Because Victorian morality only existed in the shop window. On the street, there were no rules, no conscience. While gentlemen and virtuous ladies roamed the surface by day, different masks were worn at night. According to police records, thousands of women during this period tried to survive by selling their bodies off the books, and each one was trying to escape not from society, but from the injustice bred within the system itself. Although the Victorian era is often presented as the golden age of modernization and urbanization, it was actually a period that amplified both societal class divides and the painful silence of women. Behind the lights, the darkness grew even deeper. That's why the elegant, fairy tale image of Victorian London was perhaps one of history's greatest illusions. They existed, but they were ignored. They breathed, they worked. They may be loved, but their names didn't appear in history books. The women working in brothels during the Victorian era were one of the most painful truths remaining behind the veil of mist that hid the era's true face. They were not the women of the gleaming castles, but of the damp basements, the back streets, the dark street corners. And they were all trying to exist within a life that the system had given birth to and then denied. These women had mostly been cast here, fleeing from poor neighborhoods, unemployment, domestic violence, and abandonment. Many of them had learned about life and womanhood before they even turned 15. The label stuck to them as they walked the streets pushed them to the margins of society. They had no profession, no education, no second chance. Because the moral society of the era only recognized repentance for its own class. Brothel women didn't exist during the day. They existed only with the night. While the city slept, they worked. Each of these women, waiting silently under the streetlights or blending into the darkness with a client, was so alone that they could even feel the coldness of the stones they stepped on. Sometimes for just a piece of bread, sometimes for their little brother's medicine money, they sold their bodies. But no one wanted to hear this truth. For them, there was neither protection nor social rights. If they got sick, they were expected to work. When they grew old, they had to make way for younger ones. Often, their greatest enemies were not the clients, but the men they thought were protecting them. Beatings, insults, robbery, everything was a part of this life, and yet none of them screamed. Because even if they screamed, no one would hear. The hypocrisy of society condemned these women to the shadows. Men sought them out at night, and cursed them in the morning. Within this system, women were left with two options, either to perish or to remain invisible. And they chose invisibility. They were invisible but living, feeling, waiting women. History did not speak of these women. It was believed that it would be tainted if it did. But the real stain was in that silence that ignored them. The footsteps that didn't echo on the magnificent avenues of Victorian London were the silent cries of thousands of young women walking towards death in the back alleys. And we are now trying to hear that voice, however late. When darkness fell, the streets of Lambeth would be cloaked in a fine mist of sin. In the flickering light of the gas lamps, as shadows lengthened and shortened, there was always a woman holding her breath behind a window. She was a woman whose name perhaps no one knew, whose face was erased in a different man's dream every night. The splendid balls of Victorian London, the hymns rising in cathedrals, and the noise of royal carriages never reached the walls of her damp rooms. Yet, every night, with a new mask, she continued to live the same desperation. She sat in a lightless room on the second floor of a building with crumbling plaster and rotting wood. Lizzie was alone. But this loneliness wasn't like not talking to anyone while walking down the street. This loneliness was a silence that couldn't even drown out the noise of her own soul. Even with dozens of women around her, drunk customers laughing downstairs, and moans coming from upstairs, in the room inside Lizzie, there was only her own heart, and that heart seemed to beat less with each passing day. She had started stepping into this house at the age of 16. First as a cleaner. She was just a child. She had thought she would be happy like her mother when a customer looked at her face. But there was no love in those looks. There was hunger, and soon, she herself began to be defiled in the rooms she cleaned. The matron first taught her to be silent, then to smile. She learned on her own how not to cry while smiling. Lightless rooms. Truly lightless Eastern rooms. Even lighting a gas lamp was considered wasteful. That's why they wanted the men's eyes to get used to the dark. This way, the women also became invisible. Everything proceeded faster, less human, and less conscientious. Every night, as Lizzie's hands touched those cold sheets, she would imagine one thing: the smell of soap. Maybe waking up one day in a clean room, in a place where sunlight streamed through the window. But that sun never rose on this street. One day, Lizzie looked silently in the mirror. She didn't recognize herself. The dark circles under her eyes, the cut at the corner of her mouth, the bruise on her neck. Who was this woman? She struggled to remember the first 10 years of her life. It was as if that past belonged to a completely different universe. Now she only lived to survive. She thought she would never laugh again. That she could never fall in love with a man again. That she could never say, "I'm Lizzie," to someone again. Because she was no longer a name, but a number. The matron didn't write her name on the paper every night, but the number of men she slept with. But like every woman, Lizzie had screams passing through her. The walls of those lightless rooms didn't hear them, but was God hearing? No one was sure. Religion didn't visit these houses. Priests only walked in wealthy neighborhoods. Here, the only person praying was a woman who clung to her blanket and cried silently at night. "Oh Lord, do you see me too?" she would say, her eyes filling with tears. Maybe he did see. But why wasn't he doing anything? The grey sky of London had never felt so heavy to Lizzie, not even in the darkest hours before dawn. As she walked through the foggy streets of Lambeth, surrounded by poverty, among those houses where the smell of soot burned the throat, her feet seemed to resist not against gravity, but against her conscience. Every cobblestone she touched with her toes was like a memory echoing in her mind. Because she was now selling her body but trying not to lose her soul. But was this even possible? The house she entered to make a living, although it looked polished and splendid from the outside, opened up to a different, dark story inside. Behind the velvet curtains, there were women crying. Those waiting in a corner of the salon with their red lipstick and embroidered corset dresses were not just customers, but also victims of their own lives. Lizzie was now one of those waiting. She was only 19. She had lost her family to cholera as a child, become homeless, and entered through the back door of a brothel to survive. But that door she entered had changed not only her body but her entire world. Among the clients were lords and street thugs alike. But the worst was that not even one of them looked into her eyes as if she were a human being. In their eyes there was an emptiness as if looking at an object, and in some, a disgusting hunger. Every evening, Liz would pray inside, "Let this night pass without staining my soul. God, give me patience." One night, an older client whose smell of tobacco was given to her. The man was crude and brutal, pushing the limits of her body. After that night, Lizzie didn't speak to anyone for 2 days. She locked herself in her windowless room. She knelt by the edge of the bed allotted to her. She prayed. She cried silently. She didn't look at her face in the mirror. Because in her eyes, there was no longer shame. There was only emptiness. And that emptiness was like a test that everyone trying to protect their conscience had to pass. But one day, something happened. A young priest who came to the brothel said he came to read books to the women. Although the owner mocked him as the crazy priest who didn't want customers, the priest would leave a book in the windowless room every week. For the first time, Lizzie witnessed a human being who came just to talk. And the words in those books began to make her feel that she was still human. A human lives not only with their body but with their resistance. It said in one of them. Lizzie fell asleep with that sentence that night. For the first time, she didn't see herself in a red-lit room or among clients in her dream. She was just running barefoot in a meadow under the sun. Maybe this too was a form of resistance. To keep dreaming. To feel that she was protecting her soul. The next morning, for the first time, Lizzie smiled at herself while washing her face. This wasn't a new beginning. Maybe she would never be completely free, but she had vowed not to surrender her soul, and by repeating this vow to herself every day, she would become a symbol for thousands of women who managed to sell their bodies but keep their souls. The walls of the brothel were thick, its windows narrow. Only the breath of customers and the disappointments of the outside world entered inside. But every morning, the women had to stand in front of the mirror and learn to smile. No one had taught them how to laugh. Because those smiles didn't come from the heart. Those smiles were actually a colorful curtain draped over pain, loneliness, and fear. They were masks painted with joy but watered with blood. Every morning, as soon as Lizzie looked in the mirror, she would first pay attention to the slight dimple on her left cheek. It used to appear whenever she felt real happiness. But in recent months, it only appeared at the tip of her makeup brush. Because there was no longer real laughter on her face, nor any genuine joy. Smiling was part of her job, but the exhaustion that followed each smile was gnawing at her soul. One of the newly arrived young girls, named Emily, hadn't yet gotten used to this world. She was crying, resisting, but the rules of the brothel were clear. You will smile, you will stand straight in front of the customer. You will feel nothing. One evening, Lizzie found Emily crying with her hands covering her face. Why are they always smiling? The girl asked. Lizzie didn't answer. She just sat down beside her silently. She handed her a handkerchief. Then she said, because if you cry, you get beaten. If you don't smile, you go hungry. But if you laugh, maybe you save a little bit of yourself inside. The next morning, Emily also started to smile. But her smile was amateurish and fake. Lizzie noticed it. We all started from somewhere. She would start like that too. But that smile was the last lie a woman clung to in order to survive. Maybe it wasn't genuine. Lizzie knew well that those fake laughs were acceptable in the eyes of the customers but were a silent cry in the eyes of God. One night, a drunk man came to Emily. He spoke with rough, crude movements. He raised his voice. The girl trembled with fear. Lizzie immediately intervened. Give him someone else tonight, she said to the owner, but her intervention came at a cost. The next day, the punishment was one less meal and cleaning until nightfall. Still, it was worth it. She saw that Emily slept that night without shedding tears. Even one day was a victory in this life. In the evenings, they would go out the back door of the brothel and tell each other their real stories. I actually wanted to be a seamstress, one would say. I used to work in apple orchards in the village, another would say. These stories were log time capsules carrying the real joy behind the smiles and the lost dreams. The smiles might have been lies, but these stories were the only thing reminding them of who they really were. Over time, Lizzie noticed something. The women were teaching each other how to smile, but what was essential was solidarity. Those broken smiles were the silent scream of women who still carried a shred of hope inside. Each one was a small step taken to stand up against life again. No matter how joyfully painted, only they knew the price of those smiles. When night fell, the streets of London didn't grow quiet. Especially on the street where the brothel was located, there was no such thing as silence. The sounds of footsteps, the clinking of glass meeting alcohol, and drunk shouts pierced the air. But the heaviest silence was carried in the steps of the men entering through that doorstep. Because most of them had no name. Their faces were meant to be forgotten. For Lizzie, nights passed by counting the hours on the clock. When the clock struck 9, the brothel's main door would close, and the back door would quietly open. The real customers, the real darkness, began then. These were men with their coat collars turned up, their faces hidden by their hats. Some were lords, some were merchants, some were married, some preached sermons in front of the church congregation by day. But at night the masks fell. "Tonight I need loneliness," a customer had said once. He didn't talk to the women, didn't even look them in the eye. He had only whispered, "Just be quiet." Lizzie understood then. This man had no business with the body. He was fighting with his soul. Maybe the guilt of cheating on his wife, maybe the weight of sin pressing down on him. But he was fighting that battle next to a woman. His silence was as cold as a pillow. Some nights, the customers were polite. They even smiled sometimes. But by now, Lizzie could distinguish what kind of decay lay behind most of those smiles. Because those smiles were directed not at a woman, but at the pleasure derived from a purchase moment, a dominated body. Once, a customer had said, "Pretend you love me." Lizzie, without hesitation, looked straight at him and smiled. But inside, she said, "This is your last night." Because the first thing in the morning, she would erase that customer's name from her mind. Some men didn't leave alone at night. They would leave with a cigarette in their hand, sadness on their faces. Some would ask, "Will you remember me?" Lizzie wouldn't answer. Because in this world, for a woman to remember was to give power to the other person. And that power imbalance was the darkest part of this business. They always wanted to be remembered. But the women only wanted to be forgotten. One night, just before dawn, Emily came to Lizzie crying. "His hands were so cold," she said, but her voice was so warm. Lizzie understood in that moment. Some men burn not just the body, but the mind. And that fire was a lifelong, unquenchable blaze that seared beneath the skin. Every morning, as the women made their beds, the faces of the customers from the night before would be erased from memory. But some faces were etched in. The silent ones, the talkative ones, the violent ones, the ones who drank too much, they all left different marks. There was one customer who never said his name. But every time he came, he left a carnation at the foot of the bed. For Lizzie, this carnation was not a flower at the end of the night, but a silenced memory. Once, the police came to the street. Neighbors had heard a woman's screams. But no one inside the brothel spoke. Silence was this house's second language. Because the customer who came at night often bought not just the body, but the words too. Even the silence had been purchased with money. That's why, even if a woman's scream was heard, everyone pretended not to hear it. Over time, the women began to recognize the smell of the night's customers. The imprint of their shoes, the silence of their step, the timbre of their voice. One night, Lizzie whispered, "I don't know his name, but I want to forget his face." That face still entered her dreams. Because some faces were unforgettable. Especially those that came from within the night. And the next morning, when Emily opened her eyes, she uttered only one sentence. "I hope one day their faces disappear too." In Victorian London, cleanliness was a luxury and beauty a necessity. But the realities behind these two concepts were not the shining mirrors and lovely soap scents one might imagine today. Cleanliness was only on the surface. Beauty consisted of patchy makeup, sleepless eyes, and suppressed tears. For the women of the brothel, this routine was a war that began the moment they woke up every morning. When Emily rose with the first light, Her first task was to suppress the smells left from the night. She had never seen real soap. Instead, there were dirty cloths rubbed with lavender or lemon peel, oils diluted with scented waters. She dropped her favorite perfume onto her hand and rubbed it on her neck. But no matter how nice the scent, the story of the skin beneath it didn't change. Perfume was for them not just an allure, but a kind of mask. Who they were with that night, what they experienced, was hidden beneath that scent. Lizzie would sometimes draw the skin of another man onto hers without being able to wash off the previous one's smell. This mixture would circulate in her soul like a poison and wouldn't come out. Once, Madame Gertie had taken the girl aside and said, "You have a very beautiful face, but you will forget that face in the moments you sell it. Polish it, paint it, put on scent so you can forget. Because only then will you survive." And indeed, to survive, the women hid themselves in scents, colors, and masks. One night, a woman named Florence came out of a room with a new customer. Her eyes were red, her cheeks swollen. When her friends asked, she said, "I closed the door and just put on perfume. That's all." But everyone understood. Some things couldn't be hidden with perfume. But still, Florence continued to use the same perfume every night. Maybe I'll forget, she thought. The thing that held the rouge on the women's faces wasn't just makeup. Their gaze in the mirror as they applied it contained both self-hatred and acceptance. Each brushstroke was a ritual for living one more night, surviving one more day. One night, as Emily looked in the mirror, she whispered to herself, "I'm not beautiful, but I need to look clean." For these women, who hid their tears and adorned their pain to look clean, mornings had no meaning. There were only hours to prepare for the next night. Some would cover the scars on their skin, while others would repair the cracks in their souls with silence. Because beauty here was the only key to survival. But every scent had its price. One day, Emily's skin developed an allergy to the cheap oils she used. Her eyes swelled, her skin blistered, but she had to go to work. Madame Gertie had just said to put on some blush. One night, as Florence smiled at a customer, the man ran his hand over the woman's neck and said, "You smell like lavender, like my mother." Florence wanted to scream inside, but she kept smiling. Because that was the rule of the job. Smile, apply, hide, whatever you feel, bury it under the perfume. The women wouldn't even look in the mirror at night so the blush on their faces wouldn't smudge. They would just hold their faces at a certain angle while having sex. They would prevent their makeup from wearing off. One woman said one night, "If I cry, my mascara will run." This, in itself, was a form of resistance. Even a tear was the enemy of beauty. Over time, the women learned not beauty, but the illusion of it. One night, Florence said to Emily, "I'm surprised when I see myself naked. Because I don't know a woman without makeup, but that's not me." Sometimes, the scent left behind by the customers passing through the door at the end of the night would linger in the brothel's rooms for hours. Beneath the perfume was sweat, pain, blood, and silence. And the women would wait for morning, being painted anew with those scents. Perfume and blood, cleanliness and beauty. A mask reapplied every night, a self erased every morning. And the women, with the tears they hid inside, continued to maintain this illusion. For a woman, the greatest need for survival was not to be alone. In the dark brothel rooms of the Victorian era, this need was even deeper. To be alone was equivalent to fragility, both against threats from the outside and against emotions pulling from multiple directions inside. So, despite the system's effort to pit them against each other, These women often formed their own small sisterhood. An outsider might see women sharing the same roof but competing, but inside there was another reality. A bond woven from shared pains, washed with tears. Solidarity. Every new woman would step into this structure mostly with fear and shame. But soon, another woman's touch on the shoulder, offering a glass of water, or staying by her side through the night would be what kept her standing. Childhood memories told while combing each other's hair would sometimes bring back a mother's lost warmth. Because there, every woman was also a mirror for the other. A reflection of dreams left behind, broken hopes, silenced prayers, and thus, understanding each other's pain was easy. This understanding would, over time, turn into a silently built language. Glances that no one outside understood would turn into a bridge of compassion that healed all wounds inside. Going to a crying woman in the middle of the night, and holding her hand was often the greatest show of courage. Some women had previously tried to escape but failed. When they found a note after a friend who suddenly disappeared one night, they would read it, whispering through tears, "I couldn't escape, but you escape." These words would echo in those women's memories for years. That's why sometimes sharing a leftover morsel of food became a sacred act. Above all, being kind to one another was sacred. In the back rooms of brothels, knitting was done. Baby clothes were sewn from old shirts. A hope chest was prepared in secret, in case one day one of them might escape this life and get married. These women still had dreams. Yes. The desire to live in a world where everything was normal. The dream of an address where their own name was written on a mailbox. Sitting on a balcony drinking coffee in the mornings when the sun rose, instead of going to work. And that's why, within those dark walls, hope still circulated from hand to hand. It was a sisterly bond, unseen and unheard from the outside. This solidarity among women wasn't just emotional. It was practical too. There were women who would work in place of someone who was sick, revive someone who had fainted, put a cloth under someone who was bleeding. They weren't just coworkers. In a sense, they became nurses, mothers, daughters, sisters to each other. Sometimes they would take turns washing their hair in the sink. Sometimes they would take turns keeping watch at the door at midnight. Because some men were far too dangerous. Security wasn't in the rules of that house, but in the solidarity among the women. Most importantly, it was the sharing of shame. When a woman told of a violent memory she had experienced, the others wouldn't stay silent. They would listen to her, hug her, cry with her. Thus, that memory would become the memory of all, not just one person. The feeling of loneliness would lessen. Because shame lightens when shared. Pain stops bleeding when spoken. That's why those women would carry each other's secrets to the grave. Because often, they were the only ones to whom they told their real names. From time to time, news would come from the outside world. News like a woman who had managed to escape had married and opened a shop in another city. Such news would be not just hope, but a goal for the women inside. The whisper, "I can do it too," would spread between the walls. In such moments, everyone's eyes would sparkle. Everyone would feel again that they were not alone. Because this silent sisterhood established there would warm their hearts even in the coldest moments of darkness. And sometimes, the greatest revolutions began in the quietest places. Like a theater stage being prepared before the show, the women in Victorian brothels also had to prepare themselves before the day began. They would repair their shattered dreams in the mirrors hanging on the wall, their kohl-lined eyes learning to look as if they had life energy. They woke up every morning knowing life had diminished by one more day, and despite this, They prepared for the men they hoped would fancy them that day. Because this wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. Rent debts, the families on their backs, or the misery brought by the sound of an unfed stomach came knocking at their door anew each day. Every man who entered through the brothel door meant a new role for them. Sometimes they would have to smile like an innocent girl, sometimes act like a brave woman. Every laugh was a wound inside, every coquetry a missing piece in the heart. But they had to laugh. Because a woman who didn't laugh was either sick or rebellious. Smiling was the key to remaining in this world. For women, it wasn't an option but an obligation. Even amidst misery and necessity, imitating a genuine smile wasn't easy. Some would pray with the morning sun. God, let me play my role well today. Let them not hit me, let me not cry. These prayers were sometimes heard, sometimes just crushed between lips. But the tears would still fall on the same pillow. For them, going to sleep each night without breaking down was a victory. Some days their faces truly laughed, but this was not from happiness, but from hopelessness. They would laugh to be able to say, "After all, this life is mine, at least let me mock it." But those laughs were meaningless as long as no one looked into the back room. Because there would be a woman there looking in the mirror, unable to recognize her own face. There would be an inner voice inside asking, "Is this me?" even while laughing. And sometimes, just a smile wasn't enough. They were expected to be coy, to flirt, sometimes to be a whisper that could wipe away the pain from a man's back. The women, expected to fill the void in a man's soul, existed by diminishing themselves. Every kind word spoken would be a bandage on their breaking hearts. But these bandages would always come apart by the end of the night, and they would wake up at dawn with a burn mark on their chests. Most customers didn't leave with the same tired looks they entered with. But sometimes, just a moment of eye contact, a thank you, was enough for the woman to feel human, if only for a few hours. She would rejoice, saying, "He didn't hit me today." She would find consolation by saying, "I cried a little less today." Because this was a life where even less pain was celebrated. Over time, these laughs turned into masks. They were worn so often that the face beneath the mask was forgotten. Sometimes people came just to see these smiles. But no one knew that behind these smiles were hidden the faces of women who had wanted to scream for years but had no voice. Perhaps this was the greatest tragedy. Being forced to smile. Having to laugh amidst pain, fatigue, despair, and people believing these laughs were real. Yet, each laugh was a woman diminishing a little more, being forgotten a little more, being buried deeper inside. The history books of the Victorian era usually recorded these women's smiles as beauty, charm, femininity. But history is sometimes silent. It does not write about the cries behind the smiles, the glances drowning in mirrors. Our duty is to hear the truths that stand like screams between those silent lines and not forget them. Not every laugh is happiness. Sometimes it's just an effort to survive. While walking on London's cobblestone streets, there were whispers mixed with the city's noise. These whispers carried the word fallen spoken in a low voice next to a woman's name. In the Victorian era, a woman's value in the eyes of society was measured only by her virtue, and once she strayed from this line, whether by force or desperation, she became that woman. From that moment on, the first wall rising before her was society's invisible yet rigid judgments. To be a fallen woman was to lose not just your body, but your identity. She was no longer a name, but a whisper. Sentences starting with, "That woman," would erase her name and engrave a shame in its place. Landlords wouldn't rent to her. Dressmakers wouldn't sew her clothes. Neighbors wouldn't greet her. The woman would become isolated, erased from society while still alive. Yet, most of these women had chosen this path either because they were deceived or because they had no other option to survive. But who cared? Victorian society valued appearance more than mercy. Society's most merciless weapon was exclusion, and this wall of ostracism was built not only around the woman but sometimes around her children and family. A mother who couldn't answer the question, "What does your daughter do?" would walk with her head down in the market. A father could no longer sit in the coffee house. A brother would become the subject of mockery. The woman's sin would seemingly stain her entire family. That's why many women left neighborhoods they would never return to, houses whose names they forgot. But these women also raised walls not just in society, but within themselves. Walls woven with hopelessness, plastered with guilt, sealed with silence. Trusting no one, forming bonds with no one, not crying. Because every tear bred the fear of further judgment. Every shred of hope reminded them of the pain of falling again. Even inside the brothels, there was a class system. A newcomer, as a fallen woman, would start on the lowest floor. She would do servant's work, deal with cleaning. Moving up to the higher floors was for gaining more customers and establishing oneself. But even at the top, the woman was still alone. The number of customers might have increased. She might even be seen as lucky. But she had never been able to stop her inner descent. In every smile, a rebellion was hidden. In every whisper, a pain. Sometimes these women were as worthless as a stone tripping a man's foot on the street. But that stone was a woman's life. A life whose name was erased, whose face was forgotten, but whose soul was full of screams. The cruel sentence society imposed on women in the name of honor was actually everyone's shared sin. But the responsibility was always placed on the woman. Because the higher the walls, the easier it was to hide the truths. It was the first days of spring. The fog hadn't yet lifted, having settled over London's weary streets like a grey weight. The Victorian era was still making pomp and squalor live side by side. While horse-drawn carriages passed under the shadow of elegant hats on Regent Street, just a few streets away, a woman was trying to wipe the traces of last night's makeup with an oily cloth. Her name was Eliza. Her eyes still seemed to carry the innocence she had as a child, but the curve of her lips was now closed by a line belonging not to faith, but to the instinct for survival. Eliza felt a little more hopeful that morning. Because the customer who had come to her room the night before was different from the others. At least he had seemed so. He had introduced himself as James. He had a cane in his hand, a grey coat on his back, but his eyes were soft. He hadn't treated her like the other men. Instead of his hands rushing after undone buttons, he had held Eliza's hands. "First, I must get you out of here. This is no place for you," he had said. Eliza had cried inside at that moment. It wasn't the first time she had heard those words, but it was perhaps the first time she had wanted to believe them. That night, James had acted as if he wanted not just Eliza's body, but her life. While the old candlesticks surrounding the room's walls emitted a flickering light, Eliza remembered the childhood dream she kept hidden in her heart. A house by the sea, a small flower garden, and a husband reading books in the evening. That dream had been forgotten for years behind dirty pillows and closed windows. But James's voice had illuminated that dusty dream once more. When morning came and James was leaving, he said, "I will take you next week. Be ready." Eliza engraved these words into her heart like a prophecy. For a week, she smiled less at the customers. She climbed the stairs to her room more heavily. Because she was waiting. Perhaps for the first time in her life, time was working in her favor. She didn't tell her friends. Such hopes were not to be shared. Because a shared hope could quickly turn into a mock dream. When the 7 days came, Eliza had woken up early in the morning. She had put on her cleanest corset, combed her hair meticulously. She had applied very little blush to her cheeks. Because this time, she didn't want to look beautiful, she wanted to be plain. James had liked her like this. She sat on the windowsill until noon. Then the sun set, the street lamps lit up. The bells of the prostitutes began to ring again. But James did not come. By midnight, Eliza was still waiting. She wasn't crying, nor was she resentful. She was just staring into the void. Because the real devastation was not James's failure to come. The real devastation was that Eliza had still hoped. That hope had opened a window in the walls she thought were unbreachable for the first time. But the window hadn't brought wind. It had only let in the cold. Eliza's story was not unique. Because there was at least one James in the lives of many women in this brothel. They were all slightly different, but their endings were always the same. Some seemed genuinely good, some were just skilled liars. But their common point was that they extinguished the last hope inside the women. The men who came as saviors were actually opening the door to a second enslavement, consciously or not. In the first, bodies were sold. In the second, hope. Another woman named Lucy had a similar story. Her James had said his name was Richard. He had come with a small box of chocolates and fed Lucy chocolate. "You were the only man whose hands trembled while giving a woman chocolate," Lucy had said years later. But that man hadn't come either. Lucy would later tell the story laughing, but her eyes didn't laugh. Because after Richard, she couldn't touch any chocolate anymore. The women didn't share such stories with each other. Silence was the most sacred rule in the brothel. But when everyone looked into each other's eyes, they understood what the other had been through. Because the hope was the same, the waiting was the same, and being abandoned was a very familiar feeling. When Eliza realized that James wasn't coming that night, she didn't lie down on her bed. She watched London's wet cobblestone streets from the window. She thought maybe another woman was waiting for another James somewhere. Sometimes the Jameses would return, but then things would get worse in a different way. When they returned, they would have a contract in hand. "I'll get you out of here, but I have a few conditions first." And those conditions would open doors even darker than the brothel. Because this time, there was no legal armor. The woman would seem to have chosen her own master, but her freedom would be taken from her again. Sometimes they would move to a distant village, sometimes be taken to another city. But each time, they ended up alone. Because the Jameses didn't come to stay forever. They came only to see, to touch, or to feel like a savior themselves. And this order continued in London's foggy streets, behind torn curtains, in front of broken mirrors. Hundreds of women like Eliza waited for a man to come and take them away one day. Some sat by the window until morning, some by the door. But most of their stories ended the same way. They waited, and then they buried it inside themselves. Yet some women learned not to wait for any James. Those women built a new strength within themselves. They cleaned their own rooms. With the money they saved, they bought small books. Some learned to read and write. Some escaped to the outside world. They became seamstresses, cleaners. because they now knew that real salvation was not in a man who came, but in themselves. But Eliza's story did not end with James not coming. That night, after leaving the window, she stood in front of the mirror. For the first time, she looked at herself for a long time. Then she took a small piece of paper from her pocket and wrote this sentence on it. "I will never wait for anyone again." She placed that note under her pillow, and that night, for the first time, she fell asleep with her head on her pillow. In the East End of London, a cobbled street stretched down a slope, one of the narrow streets covered in coal dust. They called it Dock Slope. This path, where sailors once ran to ships with hope, had become, in the Victorian era, a line of only the lost, broken hopes, and irrevocable decisions. While the morning fog enveloped this slope with a new regret each day, the footsteps were always hasty. Because no one wanted to be seen here. This was a descent route where shame seeped into the cracks between walls, and women living in the shadow of desperation quietly vanished. Her name was Clara. Her hair was once the color of cinnamon, but now it had turned into a matte brown like dried blood. She stood at the top of the slope, holding her thin coat pressed to her chest, feeling as if the cold came not from her body, but from within. When she was 17, her mother had sent her to her aunt to find work. The woman she called her aunt ran a small sewing workshop in Shoreditch. But in the small room at the back, other customers were served at night. Clara grew up in that small room. First, she was ashamed, then she got used to it, and finally, she tried to forget. But there was one thing that didn't forget. The slope. Dock Slope was not the path of those who surrendered to fate, but of those who were surrendered. Most of the women who came to this path did not have criminal records. They were just poor. Some were widowed, some couldn't find work. Some simply didn't want to starve. As you went down the slope, every house had a story. Some had broken windows, some had curtains that were never closed. The women worked until morning, and during the day, they remained silent, fearing the landlord's tenants. Because this was a place where silence, not speech, was valuable. Clara remembered her first customer. When she made eye contact with him, there was no trace of the humanity she was looking for in his eyes. She understood then that in this work, neither tears, nor screams, nor silence had any meaning. The first word from her lips had been, "Just do your job." And Clara had felt at that moment that she could never be the old Clara again. A person is corrupted not when their body is touched, but when silence touches their soul. As time passed, Clara began to say to other new women, "You'll get used to it." Even though she despised herself for saying it, she couldn't find anything else to say. Because at the end of this slope, there was no other possibility. Some tried to escape, but failed. Some fell in love, and were sold out. Some got sick. They were thrown out the back door of the house. Because in this system, your value lasted only as long as your beauty and youth. When you began to decay, even the street that carried you wouldn't recognize you. One night, while waiting for a customer, Clara looked out the window. There was a little girl selling handkerchiefs on the street. She had a thin jacket on and a box resembling a basket in her hand. Watching her, Clara trembled inside. Because in that little girl, she saw her own past, and she understood then. The fall was not just physical. It began when hope was lost. Clara waved silently to the little girl, but the girl didn't notice. Because the slope was too steep even to look up. Falling down Dock Slope was easy. Just one decision, one hunger, one need was enough. But climbing back up was almost impossible. This story was not just Clara's. It was the shared fate of hundreds of women, thousands of falls. They passed from this world, fading a little more each day, losing a little more, even forgetting their own names. Only the stories of some remained behind. For most, only their shadows remained, and every night the stones of these streets whisper quietly. The fall is silent, but its traces are never erased. In the lines of a novel written in the 1890s, set in Victorian London, there is a sentence that goes, "Being a girl does not mean you have the right to choose. You cannot choose whose you will be, nor can you know how it will end." This sentence, encapsulating the truth of that era in one line, is like an entrance gate to the stories of dozens, hundreds of girls who were forcibly made into women in their childhood. In the Victorian era, being born a girl, being born into a poor family, or simply being orphaned, any one of these was enough for your life to end in a brothel. In that era, being a child did not carry the meaning of innocence, play, and protection as we understand it today. It meant burden, exploitation, and use. While families often couldn't feed their children, opportunists knocked on the doors of these bleak houses, taking young girls into service, under the mask of help. What this service entailed often didn't even need to be explained. Because the families, society, and sometimes even the girl herself had accepted the nature of what was to come. The pale light seeping through the dust-covered window pane illuminates the corner of the room as the woman inside wakes in the first silence of the morning. She tosses her hair to the side. She takes a handful of water from the tin jug to wash her hands. As the water drips from her fingers to the floor, it flows silently, almost like a prayer. The same ritual every day. Silence, cleanliness, and service. For the women in Victorian brothels who sold not only their bodies but also their souls, this was a necessity. But some were different, however invisible they might have been. Like many women, she too had initially seen this life as a temporary solution, a necessity. But over time, she had surrendered to an unseen power. She had learned that the only way to survive on a path she called her duty was to serve. While others fought with drunk customers at night, she prayed in her room. She secretly read books in doorways, educated herself, and wanted to believe that another life was possible. But walls don't talk, and dreams aren't worth money. Once, they had brought a girl with blonde hair, just like the little sister she had lost at a young age. She wasn't even 13 yet. That night, the woman had given her own bed to the girl and hadn't let the customer in. She had stayed by her side until morning, holding her hand. After that day, the other women started calling her mother. Since she didn't want customers, hardly anyone remembered her name anymore. But she was now a shadow who knew everyone's story, stroked their backs, found the salves. Over time, even the woman running the house began to treat her differently. Despite being a harsh woman, upon seeing her sacrifices, she began to harbor a quiet respect for her. Sometimes she even involved her in money matters, entrusting new women to her care. This eased her conscience a little. But when she laid her head on the pillow at night, she would close her eyes with an unheard ache. Because a woman knowing everything, seeing every pain, didn't make her strong, it made her tired. One day, an old customer returned to the establishment. But this time with a different purpose. He had a thick book in his hand. He had seen that woman's name in that book. He came before her in astonishment and said, "While you are still here, we are talking about your writings outside." It turned out that for years, the woman had been writing letters, sending her own life story and the stories of others to various places in the hope that they would reach someone one day. One of those letters had reached a journalist, then became a book, and then became the subject of debates. But the woman never saw those books, because she was still in the same bed, by the same jug, in the same prayer, silently serving, continuing to carry the burdens of others. No statue was erected for her, nor was her name written anywhere. But she was one of the quietest revolutionaries of that era. Because sometimes it is possible to defend human dignity without shouting. The door opens, and the young girl taking her first step inside doesn't even feel the floor beneath her feet. Her mind is preoccupied with the uncertainty before her eyes more than the wooden floor under her feet. Just a few hours ago, she had parted from her mother, looking into her eyes, saying, "I'll find work," and disappearing into London's foggy streets. But now, with a small bundle in her hand, she was being led through this house with damp, musty-smelling walls without even understanding what was happening. She had been directed to the marked room of the brothel. The first scratch of fate was drawn precisely at this point. That's what the room was called. The marked room. Anyone who knew the establishment could tell which way a woman would be cast by this room. If you entered that room that night, your return was hardly possible. That room was both a test and a place of ruin. To an outside observer, only a worn-out bed, a broken table, and a gas lamp emitting a flickering light in the corner might be visible. But inside, moments that would determine how life would take shape were experienced. Before being taken into the room, the new girl was made to wait silently on the side, exposed to the gazes of the other women. Each of them would scrutinize her with eyes weary from another life. Some pitied, some envied, some would look away remembering their own youth. But none would say a word. Because in this story, everyone was silent. Most of all, those who cried. Every girl who entered wasn't actually left completely alone. One of the women, usually called Mother, silent but knowledgeable, would accompany her. Before closing the door, this woman would say, "The first night is hard, but morning will come." The words were not just a consolation, but an acceptance of a reality. Because seeing the morning in that room was the beginning of turning into a woman who would never hope again. What happened in the room during the night rarely spilled beyond those four walls. But if the next morning the young girl's eyes lacked their sparkle, everyone understood that she, too, was now like the others. Joy, dreams, and resistance had long been extinguished within her. From that moment on, she no longer had a name, only a number. Number 2, corner bed. They'd call her the new one. A person was identified only by their body. Some nights, whispers would circulate among the girls. "The little one who came yesterday couldn't even cry." Or, "Not a single word came from the marked room until morning." That silence was the most feared thing. Because sometimes screams are good, they show resistance. Silence, however, was acceptance, and acceptance was the greatest loss in this house. Years later, while showing the room to another young girl, one of the women had whispered softly, "The first night may not write your fate, but it teaches you how it will be written." The girl hadn't understood. She needed to see the morning to understand. The story of this room was never recorded. Its name appeared in no church documents, nor was its trace found in London's archives. But the marked room was the starting point for thousands of women. Some broke, some tried to stay standing, some were simply buried in an eternal darkness with that single night. One of the things that most surprised the new girls was how little sound was actually heard in this crowded house. Thick walls, heavy curtains, and silent corridors. But there were also the whispers. Silent sentences spoken from door cracks, from under beds, while looking in the mirror during bath time. Because here, the knowledge of survival was transmitted not noisily, but in whispers. Those whispers were like a language. A silent doctrine, composed of unwritten but lived rules passed from one woman to another. A doctrine so profound that an outsider would never understand it, but for those inside, it was a guide to life. These rules explained ways to stay standing without being broken, pushed, or beaten, and only the women knew them. Only the women taught them. The first rule was always the same: avoid the gaze. If a new girl looked a man in the eye, the night could go differently. That's why most women had learned to look at the wall, not the customer. Sometimes this wasn't just out of shame, but for safety. Because eye contact was, for some, an invitation, and for others, a challenge. Both were dangerous. The second rule: don't become enemies with the other women. Here, everyone shared the same bed with their enemy. But the real enemy came from outside the door, not from within. That's why solidarity among women was the most precious thing. If one fell, all were shaken. That's why offering water to someone crying, silently leaving a handkerchief, was the first step to survival. No one would say sister out loud, but when their eyes met, they understood each other. The third rule: never get attached. Not to a customer, nor to yourself. Because here, emotion was the most dangerous thing. Those who fell in love were quickly consumed. Those who hoped were broken faster. That's why women had learned to leave their emotions behind even when looking in the mirror in the morning. It wasn't a smile, but a neutral face that preserved them. And then there were the fear whispers told at night. She never came back after passing through that door. Some women would disappear overnight. No one would ask what happened, because too many questions brought too many beatings. But the stories passed from ear to ear taught you where not to touch, whose shadow to avoid. And of course, the final rule: appear like a summer's day, but be as cold as a winter's night. A girl hearing this saying for the first time wouldn't understand, but within a few weeks, she would grasp its meaning. Because here, warmth was perceived as a threat. A smiling face meant weakness. Remaining cold was the only way to appear strong. These whispers were passed from one generation of women to the next. They were never written in a book nor found a place in documents. But they echoed somewhere in the ear of every woman who survived inside the brothel. Some endured for years by following these rules. Some disappeared overnight for violating just one. Tears were silent, but the advice was even quieter than a whisper. That's why the strongest here were those who remained the most silent, and by staying silent, they survived. In some places, laughter is the outward expression of genuine joy. But the laughter heard in the dark brothels of Victorian London was not genuine. It was uttered on command. When customers entered, they wanted to see a cheerful woman. A tired, thoughtful, or frightened face would spoil the customer's mood. That's why women had to bury their pains behind their lips and stitch a smile onto them. That smile was fake. Because inside, there were broken ribs. Dried blood still remained at the corner of the mouth of a woman whose teeth had just been knocked out. But a strained smile hung on her lips. If a customer had entered at that moment, they would have noticed not what the woman had been through, but how cheerful she was. There was a small mirror at the entrance of the brothel. The women looked at it the most during the night. Not to check their makeup, but to see if their smiles were convincing enough. Because if you didn't seem sincere, you might not be in the same room again. You would either be put to work somewhere worse, or you would be branded as inadequate. This brand was worse than being beaten. Because the other women would distance themselves from you, cutting you off from the chain of survival. On very rare occasions, some would laugh genuinely. Maybe when an old song played, or when a customer's gift arrived, but those laughs were immediately suppressed. Because genuine emotions didn't belong here. Showing emotion was considered weak. The weak were crushed. The strong were those who even feigned joy forcibly. Some women had begun to see this smile as part of the profession. "Your face is the first curtain between you and your customer," one of the older women would say. But the young girls struggled to carry this curtain. Especially in the first few weeks, learning to smile while your eyes were filling with tears tore a person apart inside. There were stories of a girl locked in a room all night just for sulking, of another sent to a different brothel simply for being found too quiet. Here, smiling was a performance. It was fake, but it was a survival strategy. Because a woman who looked unhappy had less chance. Whereas someone who laughed, even falsely, was found useful. Every night there was a game played in front of the mirror. The stage was set. Makeup, costume. Even if your eyes filled up, your eyelashes had to stay upright. Even if your lips were chapped, the shape had to be the same. A curved line. Your audience was on the other side of the door. You had to act. And until the curtain fell, no one could cry. Some became so accustomed to this role that years later, they no longer knew how to laugh in a moment of genuine happiness. Smiling was now just work. It symbolized not sincerity in a warm moment, but the most masterful imitation of survival. Fake smiles. They were the reflection of a desperation in the mirror. These smiles were nothing but a veil drawn over violence, fear, and hopelessness. And the veil was drawn anew every night, torn anew every morning. But behind that veil, the women tried to survive silently. Until dawn, some women didn't possess a strong body, sharp wit, or a special talent to survive. But inside each of them was a tiny spark of hope. This spark would often ignite in the light of an ordinary object, growing with a minuscule gift. Those small gifts gave birth to immense meanings in the hearts of the women working in the dark brothels of the Victorian era. A button, perhaps torn from a customer's shirt, or maybe a button left behind on purpose. That button could be kept under a woman's pillow for years. Because it was a symbol of the feeling of someone saw me. Or a handkerchief. A finely embroidered one, with initials in the corner. The woman who received that handkerchief would feel as if she were carrying not just an object, but a promise. You are not just a body. Some customers would bring the women chocolate, however little. These chocolates were very valuable on the black market. But no woman would sell it. Because that chocolate left not so much a sweet taste, but a feeling on the palate. Being treated as a human. Once, an old man took a tiny brush from his pocket and gently combed a young woman's hair. The woman didn't change her hairstyle for days, as if she thought she could heal if that touch were repeated. These gifts weren't big, but the response they created in the women's emotions was immense. Because in the brothel, emotions were usually punished. But these gifts whispered that emotions could still exist. Sometimes, even when a customer remembered a woman's name, her eyes would well up. Because most customers didn't even ask for a name. They passed through with titles like girl, beauty, sweetheart. But hearing your name, that was existence. Among the women, such gifts weren't a matter of competition. It wasn't jealousy that spread, but hope. She got a flower. Maybe I will too, would be whispered. A flower, maybe a wilted rose, maybe a wild weed from the windowsill. But the woman would take it, keep it in a glass of water. Every morning, seeing it, she would endure a little more. Some customers brought gifts to ease their conscience. The women knew this but still clung to the gift. Because the intention didn't matter, the effect did. Gifts weren't just received, they were claimed. Every small object represented not a woman's past, but her dream. Maybe one day she could leave this work. Maybe someone would truly love her. Once, a young woman was gifted a broken violin. The customer had said, "You can't play it, but maybe you'll remember." After that night, the woman always started to hear music in her ears. Because remembering also healed. Remembering silently answered the question, "Who was I?" Those small gifts turned into memory corners in the damp rooms inside the brothel. Some were stored in chests, some sewn into shirts, some placed under the pillow like a prayer. Each was a sign of the woman's struggle to remain human. Each was a breath, a smile, a secret touch like a prayer. And perhaps that's why the women feared losing these gifts the most. Because they represented not their bodies, but their dreams. Those dreams were like a thin thread keeping them standing. Fragile. Yes. But as long as it didn't break, the women still believed they were alive. The women who grew up within the brothel walls gradually gained such intuition that they could read an intention from every glance, every silence. But no matter how strong the intuition, if there was hunger in the heart, being deceived was inevitable. Because sometimes the man who spoke while looking you in the eye was the one who dealt the deepest blow to the heart. It all started with the first customer who asked, "What are you doing here?" If there was a void in the woman's heart, this sentence would quickly settle there. Then came, "You don't belong here." These words would touch her soul like a key, as if someone who truly saw her had appeared. Yet, this was only the line from the first act. Men who assumed the savior role would first listen. Having someone who listened was a miracle in itself for the women there. Because everyone spoke, everyone wanted, but no one asked. "How are you?" When a man asked and pretended to care about the answer, the woman would begin to open the shadows of her heart. Some would read poetry, some would talk about running away together. "I will save you from here." This sentence became the lie the women believed the most. Because it was a lie that looked so much like the truth. Then the gifts would increase. Prayers were whispered in low voices. Sometimes rings left by mothers were shown. As the woman felt valued, she would forget her chains. But those chains were still on her wrist. They had just become invisible. Some men wouldn't make eye contact while handing over the money. But these saviors would give while looking, and take while feeling ashamed, and the women believed that shame was a sign of conscience. What a great delusion! Because that shame was part of the mask. Only the shame that came after was real, the fact that he would never come again. The women would sometimes get ready. They would pack a bag. Some said goodbye to the others. "He will take me away," they said. They waited for hours at the door, but no one came. Because those words were only for that night. Promises wouldn't last until morning, and after each wait, the woman would shrink a little more in her own eyes. Both in her own eyes and in the world's. A woman had once said, "When you are deceived once, you are naive. When you are deceived a second time, you are a fool. But if you still believe the third time, you are just lonely." And in the brothel, loneliness would swallow everything you mistook for love. That's why sometimes the most dangerous customers were the ones who spoke the most kindly. Because they deceived not the body, but the heart. The savior role was not just a deception. It was also a method of exploitation. These men, who took the women's love, hopes, and sometimes even their money and left behind only silence. That silence would become an echoing quiet at night. No one would mention his name, but everyone understood. He's gone too. And over time, the women became ashamed of their own eyes. Because they had waited with those eyes. They had believed with those eyes. But then they learned. A real savior doesn't say he will save you. He comes silently and takes you away. And most of the time, such a person doesn't come. In the brothel, trust was as valuable as gold. But it was also the thing that fell into the mud the easiest. Because there, every word was turned into a transaction, every glance into an intention, every silence into a body. A woman might forget how many times she had been deceived, how many times she woke up alone in the morning after an "I love you." But each time she believed again, another piece would chip away from the corner of her heart. Women would open up with a smile. Because even laughing required courage there. But whenever they laughed, the lines at the corners of their eyes would betray the pain. There was no genuine laughter most of the time. If there was, the silence that immediately followed would tell the whole story. Because within that laughter was not hope, but habit. A new story would begin with a new customer. The woman would think, maybe this time it will be different. Maybe he too has been through things in the past. Maybe this man understands loneliness. Maybe this time he hasn't come just for the money. Maybe, but at the end of every maybe was a heart crashing into a wall. Because in the brothel, hope was the most sold commodity. One woman had said, "For the first time, someone looked into my eyes. As if he saw me." But a few days later, that man too had disappeared like the others. And the woman now avoided even eye contact. Because every time someone saw her, they disappeared afterward, and that was more painful than not being seen at all. Over time, the brothel women learned something. Trust is not a word that comes from the mouth. It is a gaze that is still there just before dawn. But no one lasted until morning. And that gaze would disappear in the middle of the night. The ensuing silence would suppress everything. Some women would say, "I don't trust anyone anymore." But a word, a touch of a hand, an offered handkerchief could tear down a wall like nothing else. And behind that fallen wall was a broken, tired heart. Even if that heart dared to beat again, it would grow wearier with each beat. And the worst part was this: some women even forgot how to laugh. Because hidden in every laugh was a disappointment. So they chose not to laugh. But inside them, a hope, a child, still remained. Because deep down, they still wanted to believe. Maybe one day someone would come and not just leave without even waving goodbye. Maybe they would just stay. But the brothel walls waged war against hope. Every morning, those walls rose a little higher, grew a little thicker, and the woman would become unable to escape from within herself. Whether she laughed or cried, that wall was there. Because when trust was finally broken, a person first doubted themselves. Am I too naive? Did I believe too much? They would ask themselves endlessly. When a woman sighed silently while smiling, that collapse carried the traces of all the lies, all the departures. Because no matter how strong they were, the women in the brothel were the most broken inside, and these fractures were invisible. But they could be felt in a blink of an eye, in a smoothing of hair, in a trembling hand. Over time they learned. Trust isn't given, it's earned. But on that street, no one wanted to earn it. Everyone only took, and when the women lost trust, they lost themselves the most. On the Tofane slopes, there was a small window, covered with iron bars. A window from which it was possible to see the outside from within, but difficult to understand what was happening inside from the outside. Behind this window, the same eyes waited every morning. A woman's eyes, once resembling her mother's, then those deep, silent gazes she struggled to recognize in the mirror. Every morning, the woman would approach that window. Her eyes would watch the carriages passing on the slope, the baker opening his shop, the market women walking with baskets in their hands. They would all pass by. But her steps would always freeze on the same stones. Every day she looked from the same place but couldn't wake up to a different day. Because that was where time stood still. That window was the closest but most unattainable form of freedom. The woman sometimes waited just for a breeze. A child's voice from outside, a bird's chirp, maybe the call of an old street vendor. For her, the sound of the outside had become the medicine for survival. Because the inside was nothing but an endless cycle of the same day. The customers coming in the morning, the tired women fading into sleep at night, bloody handkerchiefs, silent prayers. Escape? Of course she thought about it. Like every woman. The dream of escape had become the most common silence in the brothel. Everyone wanted to escape one day, but no one knew how. Because the dream of the outside was beautiful, its reality was harsh. Some who left were caught, some were found in worse places. Some were never found. Maybe they had gotten away. Maybe the women dreamed of escape. But those dreams came not by day, but by night. Dreams of a boat gliding on the sea, a horse running towards the forest, as their eyes closed. Upon waking, the first thing they did was look at the window. But the bars were still there, and even if the sunlight poured in, morning never truly arrived inside. One day, the woman tried to hang a note on the window. She wrote, "I am here," on a paper but then tore it up. Who would she call out to anyway? In a place where everyone was silent, what good was a whisper? So she fell silent too. She swallowed the note. She internalized it. Because the women there lived by swallowing their dreams. That window didn't just show the outside. It also reminded them of the walls inside. The woman would count those iron bars anew every day. Maybe one day one would loosen, maybe one would rust. But nothing changed. Because those walls were built not just of stone, but of fear, shame, and oblivion. Was escape possible? Maybe, but what if they were brought back? What if she was caught before escaping? The women thought like this. Because one step outside could be the beginning of another hell. That's why some never looked out the window. Seeing caused more pain, more longing, more collapse. But some attached meaning to that window. One woman would say there every morning, "Maybe he will come today." Who? No one knew. Maybe a brother. Maybe an old flame who hadn't forgotten. Maybe someone who never even existed. But hope, you see. Even if it wasn't real, it kept them alive. In those eyes looking out the window every morning, there was as much resilience as there was loneliness. Because even when the women were broken, they lived in their dreams, walked in their dreams, escaped in their dreams. And sometimes a pigeon would land on the windowsill, tilting its head. When the woman smiled silently, she would cry less that day. Because that pigeon was a sign of escape, of freedom, perhaps even of God. In that moment, the walls behind the window seemed to thin a little. But then someone would knock on the door. Her eyes would fall to the floor, not the window. The dream of escape would be postponed until the next night, and the brothel's walls would rise a little higher inside every woman. The brothel walls, when viewed from the outside, were perhaps just stone, tile, and wood. But for those looking from the inside, These walls carried different sounds. Because what echoed inside wasn't just footsteps or the creaking of opening doors. There was a silence coming from within. A deep, vast, heavy silence. And this silence was reborn and died anew in the same cycle every day. Within this silence, sometimes a woman would pray, whispering to herself. In a slow, unhurried tone, words hesitantly leaving her mouth. This prayer was sometimes incomprehensible, but the intention was clear. To be forgiven, not to be forgotten, or just to see the morning. Sometimes a woman would whisper as if writing a letter to her mother. I am here, mother. You don't hear my voice, but I call out to you every night. Even if no one read them, unwritten letters were sewn into the nights. Someone from another room would sing a song. Those songs might have seemed like love ballads, but they carried a void washed with sorrow. Some sang old folk songs. Some whispered French melodies. With a few words learned before being taken to the palace. Because singing was sometimes a way to escape crying, or a way to hide tears. But the heaviest thing within this silence was the suppressed cries. Some women would bury their face in the pillow. Some would pull the quilt up to their mouth and stifle their breath. Because crying, when audible, would break others too. That's why the cries inside were silent. Muffled inward. Perhaps that's why they hurt more. The stories the women told each other were also in a whispery tone. One would say, I'm actually from Mesa. Another would close her eyes and add, I swam in a creek in Amaja once. These stories were short, sometimes unfinished, but they carried the scent of home. Because talking about the past made them forget today for a few seconds, and in those moments, the inner silence would lighten a little. Some nights, a woman would stand in the middle of her room, take a closed book in her hand, and pretend to read from it. As if she had an audience. Because there was no real audience. But the stage was always there, and the actors were always the same. The women, the memories, and the swallowed words. One day, when a very young girl was brought from outside, she spent her first night in silence. She didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't sing either. She just stared at the ceiling. Her eyes were huge. Her gaze was blank. An older woman from the next room approached her. She reached out her hand but didn't speak. She just placed her palm in the girl's hand. At that moment, the silence intensified so much it became almost tangible. For a few minutes, only two palms touched each other. No words were needed. Because the deepest conversations there were conducted in silence. Years later, a woman describing these silences would say, It was such a place that words were a luxury. Speaking required courage. But we understood each other best when we were silent. And that silence, coming from behind the doors at night, buried in pillows, whispered to the walls, that silence gradually became an identity. The shouts of the crowd outside found no echo here. Because this place was the abode of swallowed screams. If the women inside spoke, perhaps the world would turn differently. But they stopped speaking. Because silence was the greatest resistance. The street is narrow, the stones are wet. The light from the lamps doesn't quite reach the young girl crouched by the curb. Despite her face looking like she just passed 15, the weariness in her body makes her sit like a woman adorned with 50 years. The old cloak she's wrapped around herself can neither stop the cold nor the gazes of the men passing by on the street. A vagrant slows his step, then moves away. The girl waits without raising her head. This is an ordinary night for her, but the street is more familiar with her silence than her presence. Being a policeman in Victorian London often meant learning not to see. especially in the areas around brothels, because the state preferred a giant mechanism working behind the visible facade. On these streets where crime, misery, and brothels intertwined, maintaining order often meant not disrupting the order. For many police officers, looking into the girls' eyes meant noticing things they weren't supposed to see, and that was against the job description. When they stopped someone, it usually didn't go beyond a warning, because stopping them meant clogging the system. Yet the system flowed this way, the city breathed this way. And the state was the silent partner in this cycle. Everyone knew something, but no one raised their voice. The ministry records contained the names of thousands of women, diseases, suicides, disappearances as statistics. But no chart could describe the fear experienced by the girls startled by footsteps at night. The files opened on London streets often gathered dust without being closed. Because these women were neither real citizens nor rights holders. They were just little notes attached to the edge of the system, written to be ignored when necessary. Society was the cruelest face of the matter. The same people who turned their faces away when passing through the street, who scorned these women by day, were the ones who sought them out at night. The women had become figures who were both desired and despised. Declared sinners in church sermons, they ended up in the arms of hands that had even forgotten God's name in the back alleys. This hypocrisy wounded the girls' souls the most. Because not only their bodies, but their hearts were also being shattered. The women who lectured about morality at the breakfast table would silently spit when they saw these girls walking on the road in the evening. Once, when a young woman named Mary sought refuge with the police, she showed them a bloody shirt. A customer had stabbed her. The police officer glanced at the shirt. Then he shrugged. "Who knows what you did to anger the man?" he said. Mary said nothing. What could she say? At that moment, she just stuffed her shirt into her pocket and returned to the street. After that day, Mary's walk changed. One side of her always limped. No one asked her what happened. Because society had learned to remain silent instead of asking questions. The regulations issued by the state existed only on paper. The regular examinations conducted under the guise of protection had actually turned into a form of surveillance and stigmatization. The women would line up, undress, and become numbers. Each one was labeled, watched, controlled. But they had neither rights nor a voice. After an examination, one woman, trembling, had said, "I wish I were sick. At least then I wouldn't be treated like a human being." Because even illness was a kind of protective armor in this system. They would at least leave the sick one alone for a while. Society's moral concerns never reached these women. Everyone was talking, but no one was listening. Once, a group of young girls stood in front of a brothel and shouted at the customers coming and going. "Aren't you ashamed?" The men stopped, smiled. Then they went inside. Because shame was only necessary for others, not for themselves. Over time, the streets grew darker. The lamps were lit, but there was no light in anyone's eyes. The women became more silent. Because making noise meant attracting attention. And attracting attention meant danger. Many young girls forgot their names. They just carried their bodies from night to night. Because in this system, having a name was an unnecessary privilege. The police, the state, society had surrounded these women like three separate walls. None could escape. Every exit closed another door. Every hope turned into a new disappointment. And the worst part was that they got used to it. Getting used to it was the greatest destruction. Because as they got used to it, resistance decreased, and silence increased. On a rainy morning in London, a young girl was crying as she looked out the window. Maybe she was 17. Her name was unknown. Her story wasn't written. But her tears were the silent witness to this centuries-old darkness. The police were waiting at the end of the street. The state had archived her file. Society had turned its eyes away. And that morning, for the first time, the girl murmured, "When the doors close, only darkness seeps inside." The darkness hadn't yet fully fallen, but the language of the streets had fallen silent. The sky was gray, the color reminiscent of the old stones of Topkapi Palace. The brothel's back door creaked open as usual. The girl who came out wrapped the faded dress she was wearing tightly around her body. Then, stepping quickly, she plunged into the narrow alley. Her name was Eliza. At least, that's what she called herself. Her real name, the one her mother called her as a child, had long been forgotten. Today, there was only Eliza, and tonight, Eliza was going to escape. Everything was planned. 2 days ago, she had memorized the sentence she overheard from a drunk customer. "The goods for Portsmouth leave tonight." If she could sneak into one of the caravans heading to the port, maybe she could get away on a ship from there. Maybe to France, maybe to another country, it didn't matter where. Just so she could wake up to a morning without the shadow of these damp rooms, the cries of her sisters, the hours of waiting behind the door. She wasn't running, that would draw attention. She was walking, but fast. In her hand was a small cloth bag containing a slice of stale bread, a few pennies, a rusty needle case left by her mother, and a torn handkerchief. That was what truly kept her going. Because embroidered in the corner of the handkerchief was a sentence. "Every morning is another possibility." Remembering this sentence would always make her eyes well up. But tonight she couldn't let them. She couldn't see. She mustn't be sad. She couldn't slow down. Because if this city caught you once, it would never let you go. And today, Eliza wanted to believe that London would let her go.